Welcome to Liturgy of Whispers. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Something that costs you nothing but a moment of your time. Leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from right now, and what hour it is where you are. Because this story, the one I am about to tell you, is the kind that feels different depending on the darkness outside your window. It feels different when the floor beneath you is still, when the walls around you are quiet, when everything you trust about the solid earth seems permanent and unshakable. Remember that feeling. Hold on to it. Because the people living along the banks of the Mississippi River in the winter of 1811 felt exactly the same way, right up until the moment the ground beneath them opened its mouth and swallowed everything they had ever known. This is not a story that begins with a scream. It begins with a sound no living person had ever heard before, and no vocabulary had ever prepared them for. Survivors would later struggle to describe it, reaching for words that did not exist, borrowing metaphors from thunder, from cannon fire, from the groaning of massive ships splitting apart in frozen seas. But none of those comparisons were sufficient. None of them captured what it truly sounded like when the earth, this ancient, indifferent, supposedly immovable earth, decided to speak. And what it said, in the early hours of December 16, 1811, was something close to a verdict. The New Madrid seismic zone sits quietly beneath the American heartland, invisible and patient, running through what is today Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. In 1811, this region was a frontier, a wilderness of dense forest, wide rivers, and scattered settlements occupied by a mixture of Native American tribes, European settlers, French Creole communities, and enslaved people who had been brought there against their will to work land that did not belong to anyone who claimed to own it. It was a world layered with secrets long before the ground ever moved. And when the earthquakes came, they did not simply destroy buildings and reshaped rivers. They exposed things. They surfaced things that had been buried, literally and figuratively, in the dark. The first tremor struck at approximately 2:15 in the morning, a time when the world is at its most vulnerable, when the line between sleeping and waking is thin, and the mind is poorly equipped to process catastrophe. People were thrown from their beds. Chimneys collapsed inward. Livestock screamed in the dark. The Mississippi River, one of the most powerful waterways on the continent, behaved in ways that witnesses described as supernatural, and that scientists would later classify as among the most extraordinary geological events in recorded North American history. The river appeared to run backward. Entire islands vanished beneath the surface. New lakes formed within hours. The land itself rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond. Witnesses describing waves of earth moving visibly across open fields, as though something enormous was turning beneath the soil, as though something that had been lying still for centuries was finally, terribly, waking up. There was a town. Its name has been softened and complicated by history, shifted through French and English translations. But the community that existed at the epicenter of these events was known in the local vernacular as Little Prairie, a settlement perched at the edge of the river in what is now Missouri. It was not a large place. It was the kind of settlement that exists in the margins of historical records, populated by the kinds of people who rarely make it into official documents unless something goes wrong. Farmers, trappers, families who had come west looking for something they could not name, and people who had been brought there in chains, whose names were recorded only as property values in estate ledgers.
whose experiences of that night have survived only in fragments, passed through generations in oral tradition, in whispered accounts that the official record was never designed to preserve. What happened to Little Prairie on the night of December 16, 1811 is both documented and deeply incomplete. We know that the settlement was largely destroyed. We know that the ground fractured and sank in places, that what geologists call sand blows erupted across the landscape, columns of dark water and liquefied sand shooting upward through the earth like the ground was bleeding. We know that survivors fled. But what we do not know, what the official record has never been entirely honest about, is what else was lost that night. What else disappeared beneath the surface? What secrets that small isolated community carried into the dark with them? Secrets about land and ownership and violence, and the particular brutality of life on the American frontier, and whether any of those secrets were ever meant to survive. Because here is the thing about earthquakes that the geological textbooks do not spend much time discussing. They are not neutral events. They do not destroy things randomly or fairly. They expose fault lines. And I do not mean only the ones beneath the earth. The social fault lines. The moral fault lines. The places where a community has been under pressure for so long that the surface has become a lie. A thin, maintained fiction of normalcy stretched across something dark and unstable underneath. And when the ground moves, when the literal foundation of daily life is suddenly and violently removed, those other fault lines become visible too. People make choices in disasters that they would never make in ordinary times. People reveal themselves. And sometimes the earth, in its blind geological indifference, does the revealing for them. We will come back to Little Prairie. We will come back to the people who lived there, to the ones whose names we know, and the ones whose names we do not, to the accounts that survived, and the ones that were deliberately lost. But first, I need you to understand the scale of what happened in the winter of 1811 and into 1812. Because without that understanding, the rest of this story will not carry the weight it deserves. The New Madrid earthquakes were not one event. They were a sequence of catastrophic tremors spanning several months, the largest of which, occurring on February 7, 1812, is estimated to have registered between magnitude 7.5 and 8.0, making it one of the most powerful earthquakes in the recorded history of North America. Church bells rang in Boston. Sidewalks cracked in Washington, D.C. The shaking was felt across more than 2 million square kilometers. And at the center of it all, in that river-soaked, forest-dark, secret-laden stretch of American frontier, the world as people knew it simply ceased to exist.
The river did not behave like a river anymore. That is the sentence that appears in different forms in nearly every first-hand account that survived the winter of 1811 and 1812, written in journals, scratched into letters that took weeks to reach their destinations, spoken aloud in testimonies recorded by curious journalists and government officials who traveled to the region months after the worst had passed. The river did not behave like a river anymore, and for the people who lived along its banks, for the farmers and trappers and traders, and the enslaved men and women who had been forced to build their lives in that fertile, dangerous corridor, that sentence carried a weight that went far beyond the geological, because the Mississippi River was not simply a body of water to these people. It was the organizing principle of their entire existence. It was the road and the boundary and the food source and the fret. It was the thing that made the land valuable and the thing that could take everything away. And when it stopped behaving according to the rules they had always known, something deeper than fear moved through the surviving communities, something closer to a loss of faith, not in God, though that came too for some of them, but in the basic reliability of the physical world, in the idea that the ground beneath your feet is solid, in the idea that tomorrow will resemble today, in the idea that the things you have buried will stay buried. There is a particular kind of terror that has no name in most languages, the terror not of a specific threat, but of the sudden and total removal of everything you believed was permanent.
children who survived the New Madrid earthquakes described it in their later testimonies with a remarkable consistency, regardless of their background or the language they spoke. They all described the same central experience, the moment when they understood, fully and without any possibility of comfort, that the earth itself could not be trusted. One account, preserved in a Missouri historical archive and attributed to a woman named Catherine Russell, who was 11 years old during the first tremors, describes lying on the ground outside her family's collapsed cabin and watching the field in front of her move. Not shake, move. She wrote, decades later, that the earth rolled like the back of something breathing, like something enormous was shifting beneath the skin of the world, and that she spent the rest of her life, all 67 remaining years of it, never fully losing the sensation that the ground beneath her feet was temporary, that it was a surface, that something else entirely lay underneath. What lay underneath, in the most literal geological sense, was a zone of ancient fault lines that scientists would not fully understand or map for another century. The New Madrid seismic zone is an intraplate seismic zone, meaning it exists not at the edge of tectonic plates, where most major earthquakes occur, but deep within the interior of the North American plate, in a place where the crust was rifted apart approximately 500 million years ago and never fully healed. The rift failed. The continent moved on without it. But the wound remained, compressed and stressed and waiting beneath hundreds of millions of years of sediment and soil and river deposit, beneath everything that human beings had built and planted and buried and called civilization. And in 1811, without warning, without any instrument capable of detecting the pressure that had been building for centuries, it released. The release happened in stages, and this is important to understand, because it shaped the psychological experience of everyone who survived the initial tremors. The first major earthquake on December 16th was catastrophic, but it was followed by a period of aftershocks, hundreds of them, some strong enough to be classified as major earthquakes in their own right, that continued for weeks. Imagine surviving the destruction of your home, the disappearance of landmarks you have used your entire life to navigate, the transformation of familiar land into something unrecognizable, and then being unable to find solid ground, literally or figuratively, because the earth continues to move beneath you every few hours. Imagine trying to rebuild, trying to make decisions about where to go and what to do, while the ground keeps reminding you that your decisions are provisional, that the earth has not finished speaking. For the enslaved population of the region, this experience carried additional dimensions of horror that the historical record has been criminally slow to acknowledge. The destabilization of the physical landscape created, briefly and in isolated instances, opportunities for escape that the rigid geography of the pre-earthquake frontier had not provided. Several accounts, recovered from plantation records and legal documents of the period, reference enslaved individuals who disappeared during the chaos of the earthquakes and were never recovered. The official language of these documents is the language of property loss, of inventory discrepancy, of searches conducted and abandoned. But read between those lines, read into the silence that follows the formal accounting, and you find something else. You find people. You find human beings who looked at the cracked earth, and the reversed river, and the collapsed structures of the system that imprisoned them, and made a calculation. You find people who ran. How many of them made it, we do not know. The geography that the earthquakes created was in many ways more treacherous than what existed before. New swamps, sunken lands, flooded forests, altered river channels that made navigation by any means extremely difficult. Some who fled almost certainly did not survive the landscape itself. But some did. And their stories, the stories of people who used a geological catastrophe as the instrument of their own liberation, are among the most profound and least told narratives of this entire event. They exist now only in fragments, in the oral histories of communities whose connection to that time and place has been maintained through generations of deliberate remembrance, in the absence of official documentation. Because the official documentation was never designed to remember them as people, it was designed to remember them as losses. The town of Little Prairie did not simply collapse, it sank. The process that geologists call liquefaction, in which saturated soil loses its structural integrity during seismic activity and behaves temporarily like a liquid, transformed the ground beneath the settlement into something closer to quicksand. Buildings did not fall over, they went down. Slowly in some cases, and in others with a sudden finality that left no time for the people inside to understand what was happening to them. The land surface dropped by several feet across a wide area, and the Mississippi, always waiting, always patient, moved in to fill the space that the earth had vacated. And with the water came something that the survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe, and that the historical record would spend the next 2 centuries trying to contain. Because when the ground liquefied and the river moved through the settlement, it did not only carry away the things that people had built,
It surfaced things. It brought up from beneath the earth objects and materials that had been buried there, some of them recently, some of them not so recently, some of them belonging to a layer of human activity in that place that predated the European settlement by generations, and some of them belonging to a much darker and more recent history that certain members of the Little Prairie community had very specific reasons for wanting to remain underground.
There are things that communities bury on purpose, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech, literally, deliberately, with full knowledge of what they are doing and why they are doing it, with the understanding that the earth is the most reliable keeper of secrets that human civilization has ever found, more reliable than locked rooms, more reliable than burned documents, more reliable than the silence of witnesses who can always, under enough pressure, be made to speak. The earth does not speak. The earth does not remember in any way that courts can subpoena, or journalists can publish, or historians can footnote. The earth simply holds. And the people of the American frontier in 1811 understood this with a practicality that more comfortable eras have preferred not to examine too closely. They buried things. They buried people. They buried evidence. They buried the residue of choices made in desperation and violence and greed, in the particular moral chaos of a frontier where the law was distant, and the consequences of certain actions could be made to disappear beneath 3 feet of river soil if you were willing to do the work before dawn. What the new Madrid earthquakes did, among their many geological and human consequences, was challenge the fundamental premise of that arrangement. The earth, it turned out, was not as reliable a keeper of secrets as everyone had assumed. The liquefaction that destroyed Little Prairie and dozens of other settlements along the river did not simply swallow things, it also expelled things. The process works in both directions. Pressure moving downward forces material upward, and across the affected region in the weeks following the major earthquakes, survivors and investigators, and simply curious observers, recorded finding objects and remains at the surface that had no business being there. Animal bones from depths that suggested burial decades or centuries prior. Personal effects, clothing, tools, items of domestic use surfaced in fields far from any standing structure, and in several locations that the official reports describe only vaguely, using language carefully chosen to foreclose rather than invite further inquiry, human remains. The official record of the New Madrid earthquakes is a document of remarkable selectivity. This is not an accusation, it is an observation about the nature of official records in general, and about the specific conditions of early 19th century American frontier society in particular. The people responsible for creating and maintaining those records had interests, they had reputations, they had investments, financial and social and political, in particular versions of events. And they had, operating always in the background of every decision about what to write down and what to leave out, the awareness that certain truths about life in the Mississippi River Valley in 1811 were not truths that the emerging American national narrative had any appetite for. The story that the young republic preferred about its western frontier was a story of progress, of civilization being carried bravely into wilderness, of hardship nobly endured and nature heroically conquered. It was not a story with much room for the things that actually happened in places like Little Prairie, the violence that preceded the violence of the earthquakes, the crimes that the earth, in its geological indifference, briefly and partially illuminated before the water closed over them again. There was a man. There is almost always a man in these stories, which is not a statement about gender so much as a statement about power and who was permitted to exercise it without accountability in early 19th century America. His name in the surviving documents is recorded as Harlan Joss, and he appears in the Little Prairie community records as a landowner of moderate means, a trader who dealt primarily in furs and occasionally in other commodities that the records do not specify with any precision. He is mentioned in 2 letters written by a Methodist circuit preacher named Elwood Marsh, who traveled through the region in the summer of 1811, approximately 6 months before the first earthquake. The letters, which were preserved by Marsh's family and eventually donated to a Tennessee Historical Society in the 1940s, describe Joss in terms that are careful but not entirely neutral.
Marsh notes that Joss is a man of considerable local influence. He notes that certain members of the community, particularly those whom Marsh describes as the more recently arrived families, speak of Joss with what the preacher characterizes as a cautiousness that seemed to him disproportionate to ordinary social deference. And he notes, in a sentence that he appears to have considered carefully before writing, that he observed during his stay in Little Prairie 2 occasions on which individuals in conversation with Joss underwent a visible change in their manner that Marsh could only describe as the change that comes over a person when they suddenly remember something they have been trying very hard to forget. Marsh does not elaborate. He moves on, in both letters, to other observations about the community, the state of the roads, the quality of the soil, the spiritual receptiveness of the population. He does not return to Harlan Joss, but the portrait he has sketched in those few careful sentences is recognizable. It is the portrait of a man who holds power through the specific mechanism of shared knowledge, through the fact that certain people in his community know things about him, and know also that he knows things about them, and that this mutual knowledge creates a web of enforced silence that functions as effectively as any legal contract, and is considerably more binding, because it cannot be dissolved by any court. What Harlan Joss knew about the people of Little Prairie, and what they knew about him, died with most of them on the night of December 16, 1811. His name does not appear in any post-earthquake record. He is not among the survivors who filed claims for lost property with the territorial government. He is not mentioned in any of the journalistic accounts of the disaster that were published in Eastern newspapers in the weeks and months following the event. He simply vanishes from the documentary record, which is itself a kind of document, a negative space in the shape of a man, an absence that, once you have noticed it, is very difficult to explain away as simple record-keeping failure. The preacher Marsh, who was not in Little Prairie when the earthquakes occurred, learned of the disaster through correspondence several weeks after the fact. Among his papers, there is a single additional reference to the community, written in January of 1812. It is brief. Marsh records that he has heard of the destruction of Little Prairie, and that he prays for the lost. And then, in a sentence that his descendants apparently did not find remarkable enough to comment upon, but that stops the careful reader with the force of something very close to confession, he writes that he hopes the river has been merciful in what it has chosen to keep, and what it has chosen to reveal. Hopes the river has been merciful in what it has chosen to keep, and what it has chosen to reveal. A preacher, writing about a natural disaster, expressing hope not that the survivors are safe, not that the dead are at peace, but that the river has exercised discretion, that it has made good editorial choices about what to surface and what to leave submerged, that the geological catastrophe that destroyed an entire community has in its blind and indifferent rearrangement of the earth managed to preserve the particular configuration of buried things that certain people needed to remain buried. That sentence has haunted every serious researcher who has encountered it. It haunted the Tennessee Historical Society archivist who first cataloged the Marsh Papers in 1962 and noted the reference in a footnote that described it as curious without pursuing it further. It haunted the graduate student who came across that footnote in 1987 and wrote 3 pages about it in a thesis that was otherwise concerned with frontier religious practice, and that those 3 pages survived only because the student kept a personal copy when the university library eventually deaccessed the bound typescript. And it haunts this story because it is the kind of sentence that can only be written by someone who knows something specific, not something general about the darkness of human nature or the secrets that frontier communities carried. Something specific, something about a particular place and particular people and particular things that were in the ground beneath Little Prairie before the earth moved and the river came, and the careful, terrible work of geological revelation began.
There is a particular discipline required to read historical documents the way they need to be read if you want them to tell you anything true. The discipline is not about language or paleography or the technical skills of archival research, though those matter. It is about learning to read the silences, learning to identify the places where a document shifts register, where the tone changes slightly, where the language becomes suddenly more formal or more vague, where a writer who has been specific and concrete suddenly retreats into abstraction. Those shifts are not accidental. They are the textual equivalent of a person who has been walking steadily, suddenly changing their pace, and they mark the places where the writer encountered something they needed to manage,
something that the full truth of would have consequences they were not prepared to accept. The documents surrounding the New Madrid earthquakes are full of these shifts. They are full of places where the record becomes careful in ways that careful records should not need to be, where the language of official neutrality is deployed with a precision that suggests not disinterest, but its precise opposite. A writer who is very interested indeed in ensuring that certain things are described in certain ways and not in others. The territorial government of Missouri in 1812 was a young and fragile institution, operating under pressures that modern readers rarely appreciate fully. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had transferred an enormous and poorly understood territory to the United States, and the process of establishing American legal and administrative authority over that territory was still very much incomplete by the time the earthquake struck. The region along the New Madrid Fault was populated by communities whose legal status, property arrangements, and social structures reflected a complicated mixture of French colonial law, Spanish colonial law, indigenous land use, and the improvisational legal culture of the American frontier, all of which was in the process of being subsumed into American territorial law in ways that were contentious, frequently unjust, and occasionally violent. Into this already unstable situation, the earthquakes introduced a layer of physical destruction that made the existing legal complications dramatically worse, because the earthquakes did not simply destroy property, they destroyed the evidence of property. They erased boundaries, they eliminated landmarks, they sank land that had been claimed and granted and recorded and taxed, and they raised land that had previously been river bottom and therefore technically unclaimed. And they did all of this across a region where the documentary record of land ownership was already incomplete and contested. The land claims process that followed the New Madrid earthquakes is one of the most studied and least understood chapters in the history of American public land law. Congress passed the New Madrid Relief Act in 1815, which allowed individuals who had lost land to the earthquakes to claim equivalent acreage elsewhere in the Missouri Territory. The intention was humanitarian. The result was one of the largest land fraud operations in American history. Speculators acquired claims from survivors for fractions of their value, or simply fabricated claims based on the destruction of the documentary record, and used those claims to acquire enormous tracts of fertile land across Missouri. By the time the full scope of the fraud was understood, it had already reshaped the land ownership patterns of an entire state in ways that persisted for generations. But underneath the fraud, underneath the spectacle of speculators and corrupt officials and a legal system being gamed by people who understood its weaknesses with predatory precision, there was something else happening that the standard historical account of the New Madrid land claims does not address. Because the destruction of the documentary record did not affect everyone equally, it did not affect everyone in the same direction. For some people, the erasure of the land records was a catastrophe. For others, it was a solution. For a specific subset of the population of the New Madrid region, people who had reasons of their own for wanting certain aspects of the pre-earthquake record to remain inaccessible, the destruction of documents and landmarks and the physical evidence of previous land use was not a loss, it was a reprieve. It was the earth, in its geological indifference, doing something that they could not have arranged themselves with considerable risk. It was the ground closing over the past, and the river washing away the evidence, and the official record, in the chaos of reconstruction, simply not having the capacity or the inclination to ask certain questions about what had existed in certain places before December 16, 1811. Among the land claims filed in the aftermath of the New Madrid earthquakes, there is a cluster of particularly interesting cases involving properties in the Little Prairie area. The claims are interesting for several reasons, the first of which is simply that there are more of them than the known pre-earthquake population of Little Prairie would seem to support. Historians who have examined the claims records have noted this discrepancy without being able to fully explain it. The standard explanation involves the general chaos of the record-keeping process and the opportunities for fraud that chaos created. This explanation is almost certainly partially correct, but it does not account for a specific subset of claims that are distinguished from the straightforwardly fraudulent ones by a quality that is harder to categorize. These claims are not fabricated. They reference real properties, real structures, real features of the pre-earthquake landscape that claimants describe with a specificity and accuracy that could only come from genuine familiarity with the place. And yet several of these claims are filed by individuals whose names do not appear anywhere in the pre-earthquake record of Little Prairie, people who knew the place intimately, but who, according to every document that existed before the earth moved, had never officially been there. One of these claims was filed by a woman.
This is itself remarkable, because the legal mechanisms of the period made it extremely difficult for women to hold property in their own names, and the new Madrid Relief Act, like most American land legislation of the era, was written with male claimants as the default assumption. Women who filed claims typically did so as widows, invoking the property rights of deceased husbands, and the documentation required to support such claims was extensive and often prohibitive. The woman in question, identified in the claims record only as M. Beaumont, filed her claim not as a widow but in her own name, which required her to navigate a legal process that was not designed for her and that most women of the period would not have attempted. She described the property with precision. She identified its boundaries by reference to natural features, a particular bend in a creek, the location of a stand of specific trees, a depression in the landscape, that she described in terms that correspond closely to what geologists would later identify as a pre-existing geological feature of the area. She knew the land. She had been on it, repeatedly and carefully, in a way that suggested not casual acquaintance, but something closer to the detailed knowledge of a person who had worked that land, or who had very specific reasons to know its features with exactitude. Her claim was denied. The denial is recorded in the claims office documents with a brevity that is itself informative, a single line noting that the claim lacks sufficient documentary support, which was the standard language of rejection, but which in this case was applied to a claim that was, by the standards of the process, unusually well documented. The denial was upheld on appeal. M. Beaumont does not appear in any subsequent record. She files her claim, she appeals its denial, and then she disappears from the documentary record with the same completeness as Harlan Joss, as Little Prairie itself, as so many of the people and things that the New Madrid earthquakes briefly surfaced before the water closed over them again. But she left something behind. In the margin of her appeal document, in handwriting that is different from the official script of the clerk who processed the paperwork, someone, and we cannot know with certainty whether it was Beaumont herself or someone else with access to the document, wrote 4 words that the archivist who catalogued the collection in 1978 transcribed faithfully without comment into the finding aid, 4 words that sit at the edge of the official record like something that could not be entirely contained, like a hand reaching up through the surface of the water. The 4 words are these: "He put us there. He put us there," written in the margin of a land claim filed by a woman whose name we know only as an initial, in a legal proceeding that denied her the land she described knowing with the intimacy of someone who had lived on it or been buried in it. 4 words that could mean almost anything, and that in context seemed to mean something very specific and very terrible about the nature of what lay beneath the ground at Little Prairie before the earth moved, and the river came, and the careful geological work of exposure began.
There is a moment in every investigation, whether it is conducted by a detective or a historian, or simply a person who has become too curious about something to leave it alone, when the nature of the inquiry changes. It begins as a search for facts, for the solid, verifiable, documentable kind of truth that can be placed in sequence and cited and checked. And then something happens. A document surfaces, a margin note is found, 4 words written in unfamiliar handwriting appear at the edge of an official record, and the inquiry shifts. It stops being about establishing what happened and starts being about understanding what was allowed to happen, about the architecture of permission, about who knew and who looked away, and who actively participated in the construction of a silence so complete and so durable that it survived not just the passage of time, but the literal destruction of the landscape in which it was embedded. That shift is uncomfortable. It requires a different kind of attention, a willingness to sit with uncertainty and incompleteness, and the knowledge that some of what you are looking for will never be fully recovered, because the people who could have told you were never given the opportunity to write things down, and the people who did the writing had reasons to write around the truth rather than through it. He put us there. 4 words. Let us think carefully about what those words might mean, not in the sense of speculating irresponsibly about things we cannot verify, but in the sense of taking seriously the full range of what they could indicate, and then looking at the surrounding evidence to understand which interpretations that evidence supports. The most immediate reading is the most obvious one. Someone, a man referred to only as he, placed people, the us of those 4 words, in a location that corresponds to the land being claimed. Placed them there in a way that M. Beaumont, the claimant, apparently believed gave her or them a legitimate connection to that land, a connection strong enough to support a legal claim, a connection that the official process denied. The question is, what kind of placement would create that connection? What kind of relationship between a person and a piece of land, established by a third party referred to as he,
would constitute, in Beaumont's understanding, a basis for legal claim, while simultaneously being the kind of thing that could not be openly stated in an official document, and that would result in a margin notation rather than a formal legal argument. The frontier land economy of the early 19th century American Mississippi Valley operated through several overlapping and frequently contradictory systems of establishing connection between people and land. There was formal legal title, granted through official channels and recorded in territorial offices, the kind of ownership that the New Madrid Relief Act was designed to compensate. There was the older French and Spanish system of land grants, which had their own documentation and their own legal validity under the terms of the Louisiana Purchase, but which American territorial administrators were inconsistent and frequently bad faith about honoring. There was the indigenous system of land use and territorial claim, which American law did not recognize at all, and which was in the process of being violently extinguished across the region. And there was a fourth system, less formal than any of these, but no less real in its consequences, the system by which enslaved people were moved onto land by the people who claimed to own them, cleared that land, worked that land, built the structures on that land, and in doing so created the economic value that made formal legal ownership worth anything at all, while themselves remaining, under American law, not owners or claimants, or persons with any legal relationship to the land they had transformed, but property, items on an inventory, losses to be recorded when the earth moved and they disappeared. He put us there. If M. Beaumont was a formerly enslaved woman, if she was one of the people who had been brought to the Little Prairie area by someone with legal authority over her movements and her labor, if she had worked that land and known it with the intimate precision that her claim documents demonstrate, then her claim was not legally fraudulent, it was legally impossible. Not because she lacked the knowledge or the connection, or even arguably the moral right to the land she described, but because the legal system she was appealing to did not recognize the kind of connection she had to it. It recognized title, it recognized inheritance, it recognized the formal transactions of a property system that had classified her, until very recently, as property itself. It did not recognize the knowledge of a person who had cleared a field, or planted a crop, or learned the location of every tree and creek bend and geological depression on a piece of land through years of forced labor. That kind of knowledge was not, in the legal imagination of 1815 Missouri, a basis for claim. It was simply evidence that someone else's property had been well managed. But Beaumont filed anyway. She navigated a legal process that was not designed for her, that did not want her, that had no category for what she was trying to do, and she described that land with a precision that the claims office could not dismiss as ignorance or fraud. And she wrote 4 words in a margin that have survived 2 centuries of archival processing and institutional indifference. And those 4 words contain within them a theory of ownership, a theory of connection between person and place, that the official legal system of her time could not accommodate, but that is not, for that reason, without validity. He put us there. We were there. We made that land what it was. And when the earth moved and the river came, and the physical evidence of our presence was surfaced and then submerged again, we were the ones who lost something. Not just the structures, not just the crops, not just the material accumulation of years of labor, but the bodies, the people, the ones who did not make it out of Little Prairie on the night of December 16, 1811, and whose remains, surfaced briefly by liquefaction and then resubmerged by the river, were recorded in the official documentation as nothing at all. The absence of enslaved people from the casualty records of the New Madrid earthquakes is not an oversight. It is a structural feature of the documentation system. Enslaved individuals did not appear in census records as persons. They appeared as numbers in a category, as inventory in estate records, as line items in insurance claims filed by the people who claimed ownership of them. When they died in natural disasters, the loss was recorded, if it was recorded at all, as property loss, not as death, not as the ending of a human life with its attendant grief and memory and consequence, as property loss. And in the chaos of the New Madrid aftermath, when the territorial government was overwhelmed with competing land claims and the reconstruction of an administrative system that the earthquakes had physically disrupted, even those minimal property loss records were frequently not completed. People, human beings, died in the New Madrid earthquakes in numbers that we will never know, and a significant portion of those people were enslaved, and their deaths were recorded as nothing, and the communities that mourned them had no mechanism for inserting that mourning into the official record, and so the record stands, 2 centuries later, as a document of a disaster that was survived primarily by the people who had the legal standing to be counted as survivors. There were people in the Little Prairie area who knew what the earthquake had surfaced.
There were witnesses who saw, in the days immediately following the major tremors, what the liquefaction and the river brought up from beneath the ground. Some of them wrote about it, not in official documents, but in private letters and journals, in the tentative and coded language of people who understood that they were describing something that had implications extending far beyond the geological. A letter written in January of 1812 by a man identified only by his initials R.W. and addressed to a relative in Kentucky describes visiting the area around former Little Prairie several weeks after the first earthquake. R.W. writes about the landscape with the stunned, groping language of someone trying to process something for which they have no adequate frame of reference. He describes the sand blows, the changed course of the river, the sunken land, the forests that are now standing in several feet of water. And then, in a passage that his Kentucky relative apparently found unremarkable enough not to comment on in the surviving response letter, R.W. describes finding, at the edge of what had been the settlement, in the disturbed ground where the liquefaction had been most intense, evidence of what he calls prior occupation. He does not specify what this evidence consisted of. He does not linger on it. He notes it and moves on, with the particular efficiency of a man who has decided that some observations are better made briefly and then left behind. Prior occupation, in a settlement that had existed for decades, in ground that had been, according to the fragmentary pre-earthquake record, used for agriculture and habitation. Prior occupation, noted and not elaborated upon, in a private letter that was never intended for any audience beyond a single Kentucky relative, by a witness who apparently felt that the observation was worth making, but not worth explaining. As though the explanation were something his correspondent would understand without being told, as though the nature of what he had found were something that a certain kind of person, in 1812 Missouri, would recognize immediately and know better than to ask about directly.
There is a science to the way secrets decay. They do not simply fade. They do not dissolve gradually into the general background noise of history the way that ordinary forgotten things do. The names of minor officials, the details of unremarkable transactions, the texture of daily life in places and times that no one thought to document with care. Secrets decay differently because they are actively maintained. They require energy. They require the ongoing participation of people who know the truth and have chosen, for reasons of self-preservation or complicity or simple fear, to perform ignorance instead. And because they require that ongoing participation, they are vulnerable in ways that ordinary forgetting is not. They are vulnerable to the death of the people who maintain them. They are vulnerable to the loosening of tongues that comes with age and distance and the diminishing of consequences. They are vulnerable to the kinds of catastrophic disruption, geological, social, political, that scatter the people who share a secret and remove the social structures that made maintaining it feel necessary or even possible. And they are vulnerable, most dangerously of all, to the researchers and investigators and simply curious people who come along generations later and notice the shape of the silence, who recognize that a particular absence in the record has edges that are too clean to be accidental, that the nothing where something should be is itself a kind of document. The earthquakes generated in the years and decades following the event a substantial body of scientific and journalistic investigation. The earthquakes were extraordinary enough, anomalous enough in the context of what Americans of the period understood about their geography, to attract serious attention from the scientific community of the early 19th century. Men like John James Audubon, who was traveling in the region during the earthquakes and wrote about the experience, and Myron Fuller, whose 1912 centennial study of the New Madrid earthquakes remains a foundational scientific document, approached the event from the perspective of natural history and geology, concerned primarily with understanding the physical mechanisms of what had occurred and establishing an accurate record of the geographical changes that resulted. Their work is invaluable. It is also, by the nature of its disciplinary focus, concerned with the earth and not with the people on it, or more precisely, with the people on it only insofar as their testimony illuminates the geological event. The human consequences, the social and moral dimensions of what the earthquakes exposed and what they concealed, fall outside the frame of that inquiry almost entirely. It was not until the latter half of the 20th century that historians began approaching the New Madrid earthquakes with the kind of social and cultural analytical tools that the event requires if its full significance is to be understood. And even then, the work was fragmentary and underfunded,
and conducted in the margins of a historical profession that had its own hierarchies of what counted as important, hierarchies that did not always make space for the recovery of experiences that had been deliberately excluded from the primary documentary record. The people whose stories most needed to be told were precisely the people whose stories the existing documents were least equipped to tell, and the historians who cared most about telling those stories were working against the grain of an archival system that had been built by and for the people who had the most to gain from certain silences being maintained. But some things survived anyway. They survived in the ways that things survive when the official channels are closed to them, in oral tradition, in the careful custodianships of families and communities who understood that their history was not going to be preserved by any institution, and who therefore preserved it themselves, in the unofficial archives of churches and fraternal organizations and community groups that operated outside the mainstream documentary system and kept records of a different kind, and occasionally in the official archives themselves, in the margins and the footnotes and the administrative byways of a documentary system that was thorough enough to preserve things it did not intend to preserve, things slipped through. 4 words in a margin, a preacher's careful sentence about the river's discretion, a letter writer's brief and unexplained reference to prior occupation, a main that appears once and then disappears. These fragments do not constitute a complete account. They do not add up to a narrative with a beginning and a middle and a satisfying resolution, but they constitute something. They constitute the outline of a truth that was not supposed to be recoverable, visible now only because the people who buried it could not anticipate every possible avenue of survival, could not burn every letter or retrieve every margin notation, or prevent the geological catastrophe that briefly and partially undid their work. The community that existed in and around Little Prairie before December 16, 1811, was not a simple place. No frontier community was. It was a place where multiple populations existed in relationships of extreme inequality, where the legal and social structures that governed those relationships were enforced through mechanisms that ranged from formal law to physical violence, to the more diffuse but no less effective coercion of economic dependence and social isolation. It was a place where certain people had extensive power and exercised it with the casual brutality that extensive power, left without adequate accountability, tends to produce. And it was a place where the evidence of that brutality was managed, contained, made to disappear through the ordinary mechanisms available to powerful people in systems designed to serve them. The ground was one of those mechanisms. The frontier earth, deep and largely unsurveyed and indifferent to moral categories, was an available and reliable repository for the things that needed to not be found. The specific nature of what was buried at Little Prairie, in the years before the earthquakes, cannot be stated with certainty on the basis of the available documentary evidence. What can be stated is that the pattern of evidence that does exist, the marginal notations and the careful silences, and the letters that approach a subject and then retreat from it, and the names that appear once and vanish, is consistent with a specific kind of history. It is consistent with the history of a place where people were killed, and their deaths were not recorded as deaths, where the mechanisms of the legal and social system were used not to prevent or punish that killing, but to ensure that it left no recoverable trace. It is consistent with the history of a place where the ground had been used, deliberately and repeatedly, to contain evidence of violence that the people responsible for that violence had no other way of managing. And it is consistent, most chillingly, with the history of a place where the people who knew what was in the ground had no recourse, no mechanism for bringing that knowledge into the official record, no authority that would hear them if they tried. There is a woman named Sarah, no last name recorded, who appears in a single document from the New Madrid region dated to approximately 1814. The document is a deposition taken in connection with a property dispute that arose from the New Madrid land claims process, one of hundreds of such disputes that clogged the territory courts for years following the earthquakes. Sarah is not a party to the dispute. She appears as a witness, called presumably because she had some knowledge of the pre-earthquake condition of the property in question. Her testimony, as recorded by the clerk court, is brief, heavily paraphrased in the third-person manner of the period, and clearly edited, in the sense that there are places in the recorded testimony where the clerk's language becomes suddenly vague in ways that suggest the original words were something the clerk either could not or chose not to transcribe accurately. But 2 things survive the editing with enough clarity to be significant. The first is that Sarah describes the property with the same kind of intimate, precise knowledge that M. Beaumont demonstrated in her land claim, the knowledge of someone who has lived on and worked a piece of land in a way that leaves the landscape's features permanently mapped in memory. The second is that at one point in her testimony, in a passage where the clerk's paraphrase becomes particularly compressed and opaque, Sarah apparently says something about the ground, about what is in the ground. The clerk records this portion of her testimony as follows, and I want you to listen to this language carefully, because the care with which it avoids saying anything specific is itself a kind of information. The clerk writes that the witness made certain statements regarding the prior condition of the land, which the court finds not material to the present proceeding, and which are accordingly not entered into the record of this deposition. Not material to the present proceeding. The court has heard something. The court has made a decision about that something. The decision is that it does not belong in the record, and so it is not entered.
And Sarah, like M. Beaumont, like Harlan Joss, like the initials R.W. and the preacher Marsh, and all the other partial, fragmentary, carefully managed presences in this documentary record, disappears. She says something about the ground, about what is in the ground, and the official record of her saying it is a sentence explaining why her words will not be preserved. And that sentence, that administrative notation of an erasure, is all that remains of whatever truth she tried to place into the record on that day in 1814, in a territorial courtroom in Missouri, 3 years after the earth moved, and the river came, and everything that had been so carefully arranged in the dark was briefly, terrifyingly, brought into the light.
There is a particular grief that belongs to the researcher who gets close, who finds the edge of something true, and then watches it recede back into the documentary silence from which it briefly emerged, pulled under again by the weight of institutional indifference and the deliberate architecture of erasure that was built stone by careful stone, by people who understood exactly what they were doing and why. It is not the grief of failure. It is something more complicated than that, because the closeness itself is information. The fact that Sarah's words were heard and then deliberately excluded from the record tells us something. The fact that M. Beaumont's claim was denied with unusual brevity tells us something. The fact that Harlan Joss disappears from the documentary record on the night of December 16, 1811, with a completeness that goes beyond what geological catastrophe alone can explain, tells us something. None of these somethings are complete. None of them constitute proof in the evidentiary sense that a court would recognize. But they constitute, taken together, a pattern. And patterns are what history is made of in the end, when the documents run out and the witnesses are gone, and all that remains is the shape of what was not said, the outline of what was not recorded, the negative space in the archive where the truth should be. Let us talk about the land itself, because the land has its own testimony, and it has been, in some respects, more forthcoming than the human documentary record. The New Madrid seismic zone remains one of the most seismically active regions in North America east of the Rocky Mountains. Small earthquakes occur there regularly, most of them too minor to be felt at the surface, but detectable by the network of seismographic instruments that has been monitoring the region since the mid-20th century. Geologists have used this ongoing seismic activity, combined with the physical evidence left by the 1811 and 1812 earthquakes, to build an increasingly detailed picture of the subsurface geology of the region, of the fault structures and the sediment layers, and the hydrological systems that make the New Madrid zone both scientifically fascinating and, for the substantial human population now living above it, a subject of considerable concern. Modern estimates suggest that a repeat of the 1811 to 1812 sequence would be catastrophic in ways that the original earthquakes, for all their horror, were not. Because the Mississippi River Valley is now home to millions of people and infrastructure of a complexity and fragility that the frontier settlements of 1811 could not have imagined. But the land also preserves in its physical stratigraphy evidence of the human history that unfolded on its surface. The science of forensic archaeology has developed over the past several decades tools and methods capable of reading that physical evidence with a precision that would have seemed miraculous to the historians and archivists who worked with the documentary record alone. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR imaging that can reveal, beneath vegetation and surface disturbance, the outlines of structures and disturbances that no longer have any visible surface expression. Soil analysis that can identify the chemical signatures of decomposition, of burning, of the particular kinds of disturbance that human activity leaves in the earth even after centuries have passed. These tools have been applied extensively to archaeological sites across North America, and the results have repeatedly demonstrated that the physical record of the earth is in many respects more honest than the documentary record created by the people who lived on it. The earth does not have reasons to lie. The earth does not have interests to protect. The earth simply holds what it was given, and yields it, slowly and incompletely, to those with the patience and the tools to ask the right questions. No systematic forensic archaeological survey of the Little Prairie area has ever been conducted. This is not in itself remarkable. There are many historically significant sites across North America that have not received systematic archaeological attention, and the reasons are usually mundane: funding limitations, competing priorities, the simple logistics of conducting archaeological work in areas that have been continuously occupied and physically transformed over 2 centuries.
The Little Prairie area presents additional complications because the earthquakes themselves and the subsequent hydrological changes they produced created a stratigraphic situation of considerable complexity. The liquefaction events mixed soil layers that would otherwise have remained distinct. The river incursion deposited new sediment over pre-existing surface material. The sand blows created local concentrations of material brought up from depth. Reading the archaeological record of a site that has been subjected to that kind of geological disruption requires specialized expertise and careful methodology, and the results would necessarily be interpreted with significant uncertainty. But there is another reason why the Little Prairie area has not received systematic forensic archaeological attention. A reason that is less mundane and more troubling. The area is contested. Not in the legal sense of disputed ownership, though the legacy of the New Madrid land claims fraud means that land title in the region has a complicated history that has generated litigation extending into the 20th century. It is contested in a deeper sense, in the sense that the communities with the strongest historical and moral claim to whatever truth the physical record of that place might contain are not the communities with the institutional power to commission or conduct the investigation. The descendants of the enslaved people who lived and died in the Little Prairie area, whose oral traditions have maintained a memory of that place and what happened there across 2 centuries without any institutional support, have been asking questions about that land for generations. They have not been asking them into a vacuum. They have been asking them into a system that was designed from its foundation to not hear them. There is a woman named Dorothy Ellison Price who was born in 1931 in a small town in southeastern Missouri and who spent the better part of her adult life collecting the oral histories of elderly African American residents of the New Madrid region. Price was not a professional historian. She was a school teacher and later a community organizer, and her oral history project was conducted on evenings and weekends with a tape recorder and a composition notebook, and the kind of patient, relationship-based methodology that academic historians frequently undervalue because it does not produce the kind of evidence that fits neatly into footnotes. She interviewed more than 200 people over a period of 30 years, and her tapes and notebooks, which she donated to a small community archive in 1998, 2 years before her death, contain a remarkable body of material about the historical experience of African American communities in the New Madrid region, including material that relates directly to the events of 1811 and 1812 and their aftermath. Price's collection has been partially transcribed and is accessible to researchers, though the archive that holds it operates with minimal resources, and the finding aids are incomplete. Among the interviews she conducted is a series of conversations with an elderly man she identifies only as Mr. C, whom she interviewed multiple times between 1974 and 1979. Mr. C was in his 80s during these interviews, which places his birth in the 1890s, and his grandparents' generation in the period immediately following the Civil War, within living memory of people who had been enslaved in the New Madrid region before emancipation. What Mr. C told Dorothy Ellison Price about the history of the Little Prairie area, drawing on what he described as family knowledge passed down through generations with the specific intention of preservation, constitutes the most direct and detailed account of the pre-earthquake history of that community that the available record contains. He described a place where enslaved people were worked on land that had been cleared by their labor, on property that a man he named only as the trader had claimed through means that Mr. C's family account described as involving the displacement of previous residents, indigenous people whose own claim to the land predated any European presence, and who had been removed from it through violence and the threat of violence in the years before the settlement was formally established. He described conditions that his family's account characterized with a consistency and specificity that Price noted in her interviewer's annotations, suggested transmission of a carefully preserved memory rather than general knowledge about slavery as an institution. And he described what his family knew about the ground, about what was in it, about the people who had gone into it, not through the natural processes of burial and mourning and marked graves, but through the other process, the one that has no respectable name, the one that the documentary record of 1811 Missouri was designed to not have a name for. He said, and Dorothy Ellison Price recorded this in both the tape and the notebook, that his grandmother had told him that the earthquake had brought some of them back up, that the ground had given back what had been put into it, that people who had been in the earth came to the surface in the days after the first tremors, and that the survivors, the ones who were still alive and free enough to move through the landscape, had found them and known them and grieved them in the only way available, quietly and without ceremony, and with the full understanding that no official record would mark what they had found or what it meant. That the grief happened in the dark, between people who shared a knowledge that the official world around them was constitutionally incapable of receiving, and that the knowledge of what had been found, and what it meant about what had happened in that place before the earth moved, was carried forward deliberately, passed from person to person across generations, precisely because everyone who carried it understood that it would never be carried by any other means.
Memory is a form of resistance. This is not a metaphor. It is a historical fact, demonstrated repeatedly across the full breadth of human experience in conditions of oppression and erasure, that the deliberate preservation of knowledge about what has been done, passed forward through generations in the absence of any institutional support, in defiance of systems designed to ensure that certain truths do not survive, is one of the most consequential and least celebrated forms of human courage. It requires nothing dramatic. It requires no single heroic act. It requires only the quiet, sustained, generation-by-generation commitment to remembering accurately and transmitting faithfully, to treating the knowledge of what happened as something sacred enough to protect and important enough to carry forward, even when carrying it forward serves no immediate practical purpose, even when the world around you has organized itself to ensure that what you know can never be officially confirmed or legally actionable or inserted into the record that the powerful maintain about themselves and their history. Memory as resistance is slow. It is unglamorous. It produces no monuments. But it produces this. It produces an elderly man in 1970s Missouri telling a schoolteacher with a tape recorder what his grandmother told him, what her mother told her, what the people who survived the night of December 16, 1811, carried out of the destroyed landscape of Little Prairie and passed forward into the future with the specific intention that it not be lost, that it be here, now, for us to find. What Mr. C described to Dorothy Ellison Price across those years of interviews was not simply a history of violence and its concealment. It was also a history of community, of the specific and remarkable social world that enslaved people built within and alongside, and sometimes in direct opposition, to the system that claimed to own them. The Little Prairie area, in the years before the earthquakes, was home to a community whose internal life, whose relationships and rituals and systems of mutual support and knowledge transmission operated largely invisible to the official record and largely beyond the reach of the documentary history that the powerful maintain about the place. These people knew each other. They knew the land. They knew who was trustworthy and who was dangerous, and where the boundaries of safety lay, and how to communicate across those boundaries in ways that the people with power over them could not easily intercept or decode. They had, in other words, built the infrastructure of survival under conditions specifically designed to prevent them from doing so. And that infrastructure, that web of relationship and knowledge and carefully maintained collective memory, was what made it possible for the truth of what happened in that place to survive the destruction of every official mechanism that might otherwise have preserved it. The earthquake did not destroy that community. This is important to understand. The earthquake destroyed the physical settlement, the structures and the cultivated land, and the geographical features that had organized daily life in that place. But the community, the human web of relationship and shared knowledge, survived in the people who made it through that night and the nights that followed. They scattered, as displaced people scatter, some moving further west, some attaching themselves to other settlements, some finding their way to free communities further north, some remaining in the region under conditions that continued to involve various forms of coercion and exploitation. But they took with them what they knew. They took the knowledge of what the ground had held, and what the earthquake had briefly surfaced, and what the river had then covered again. They took the names of the people who had been in that ground, and they took the names of the people who had put them there. The name that Mr. C gives for the man his family's account identified as primarily responsible for the violence at Little Prairie is not Harlan Joss. It is a different name, one that Price records phonetically in her notebook with a notation indicating uncertainty about the spelling, a name that does not appear in any of the documentary sources I have described in this account. This is not necessarily a contradiction. The frontier record of the New Madrid region is sufficiently incomplete, and the practice of recording different names in different contexts sufficiently common in that period, that a single individual might appear under different names in different documentary streams, or might appear in the oral record under a name that was never used in official documents at all. What is significant is not the specific name, but the consistency with which the family account, as transmitted through Mr. C, characterizes this individual. He is described as a traitor. He is described as a man of local power who operated through the specific mechanism of controlling information, of knowing things about people that they needed him not to reveal. He is described as a man whose relationship to the land was extractive in the most literal sense, who understood the earth not as a place to live, but as a resource to be used, including its capacity to receive and retain what needed to be hidden. Price asked Mr. C in one of their later interviews whether his family's account said anything about what happened to this man after the earthquake. The answer, as Price recorded it, was careful and considered, delivered by a man who had thought about this question for a long time and had arrived at an answer that he held with some complexity. Mr. C said that his family's account offered two versions of what happened, versions that were not necessarily contradictory, but that emphasized different aspects of the same outcome. The first version was that the man died in the earthquake, that he was in Little Prairie on the night of December 16, 1811, and that he did not survive what happened to the settlement, that the ground, which had served him so reliably as a repository for the evidence of his actions, had, in the end, taken him as well, had closed over him with the same indifference with which it had closed over everyone else, and that whatever he knew, and whatever he had done, went with him into the earth in a moment of geological justice that was not really justice at all, but simply the blind operation of tectonic forces that did not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, between the people who had put things in the ground and the people who had been put there. The second version was more complicated and more troubling. The second version held that the man survived, that he was not in Little Prairie on the night of the earthquake, that he had traveled away from the settlement in the days before, for reasons that his family's account did not specify, but Mr. C characterized, with a precision that suggested this detail had been carefully preserved, as reasons that had nothing to do with any foreknowledge of the earthquake, and everything to do with the ordinary operations of a man who moved frequently and strategically through a landscape he was using for his own purposes. That he came back to the region after the earthquakes and found the settlement destroyed and the ground disturbed, and understood immediately and with considerable relief that the disturbance, however dramatic, had not been comprehensive enough to expose what he needed to remain unexposed. That he filed a land claim, or had a land claim filed on his behalf, and used the chaos of the post-earthquake reconstruction to re-establish himself in the region under conditions that the destruction of the prior record made considerably more favorable to him than what had existed before. That he lived out his life in the Mississippi River Valley, prospering in the way that men of his type prospered in early 19th century America, and died in bed, and was mourned by the people who had reason to mourn him, and was buried in marked ground, in the kind of grave that gets a stone, and a record, and a place in the family history that descendants can point to and visit and know. Mr. C said that his family had always held both versions simultaneously, not as competing claims about a single truth, but as complementary statements about the nature of a certain kind of man in a certain kind of system. Whether this particular man died in the earthquake or survived it was, in the final accounting of his family's oral tradition, less important than what his existence demonstrated about the world that made him possible, about the systems of law and social organization and institutional power that enabled what he did and protected him from its consequences, and ensured that the people who knew the truth of his actions had no mechanism for bringing that truth into any forum where it could matter. The earthquake was an event. The system was a condition, and the condition outlasted the event by generations, in some of its most essential features outlasting it into the present, which is why this story, the story of what happened at Little Prairie in 1811, and in the years before 1811, is not simply a historical curiosity. It is a story about the present, dressed in the clothes of the past, speaking to us across 2 centuries about things that have not finished happening. Price concluded her interviews with Mr. C in 1979. He died the following year. She continued her oral history project for nearly 2 more decades, and in the interviews she conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, she occasionally went into themes that Mr. C had raised, asking other elderly residents of the New Madrid region whether their family histories contained any memory of the pre-earthquake community at Little Prairie. The responses she received were varied. Some people had no family connection to the region that predated the 20th century. Some had connections but no specific knowledge of Little Prairie. But a small number, a handful of individuals whose family roots in the region were deep enough to reach back to the period before and immediately after the earthquakes, responded to her questions with a recognition that she describes in her interviewer's notes as immediate and complete, as though she had named something they already knew, as though the question itself were a kind of signal, a way of asking whether they were among the people who carried a particular kind of knowledge, and the answer in those cases was yes. They were. And what they knew in its broad outlines was consistent with what Mr. C had told her, consistent in the way that things are consistent when they derive from the same source, when they are different streams from the same original river of transmitted memory, flowing separately through different families across different generations, and arriving, at the end of the 20th century, still carrying the same essential sediment of truth that was placed in them on the night the earth moved and the river came, and the world that had been so carefully arranged in the dark was briefly, catastrophically, brought into the light.
There is a question that every serious engagement with this kind of history eventually arrives at, a question that is easy to ask and genuinely difficult to answer, not because the answer is technically complex, but because it requires a willingness to sit with discomfort that most of us, most of the time, would prefer to avoid. The question is this: what do we do with what we know? Not in the legal sense, not in the sense of what remedies or prosecutions or formal acknowledgments might be possible, though those questions have their own importance and their own complexity, but in the simpler, and in some ways more demanding sense of what it means to carry this knowledge, to have encountered the outline of what happened at Little Prairie and in the ground beneath it, and in the official records that were constructed around it, and to continue living in a world that was shaped by that history, and by the systems that made it possible, and by the long, sustained work of ensuring that the people most affected by it would never have adequate institutional support for their memory of it. What do we do with that? How do we hold it? And perhaps most importantly, what do we owe to the people whose names we do not know, whose deaths were not recorded as deaths, whose presence in the earth of the New Madrid region was surfaced briefly by the geological forces of 1811, and then submerged again by the river, and by the more deliberate and purposeful forces of institutional erasure that the river, in its geological indifference, could not have anticipated or prevented. These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that the oral history tradition that Dorothy Ellenson Price spent 30 years documenting was itself trying to answer, in its own way and through its own methods. The communities that carried the memory of Little Prairie forward across 2 centuries were not simply preserving information. They were doing something more active and more morally significant than that. They were insisting on the personhood of people whose personhood the official record had denied. They were performing, in the only venue available to them, the act of witness that the courts and the territorial offices and the newspaper accounts and the scientific surveys of 1811 and 1812 had refused to perform. They were saying, generation after generation, in the spaces between the official silences, these people existed. They had names. They had relationships. They had knowledge of the land they lived on and labor they performed, and experiences of beauty and terror and grief and connection that the system that claimed to own them could quantify as property value, but could not extinguish as human reality. They existed. The earth held them, and we remember them. That act of insistence, sustained across 2 centuries without institutional support and frequently in the face of active institutional hostility, is one of the most remarkable features of this story. It is also one of the most instructive, because it demonstrates something about the nature of historical truth that the documentary tradition, with its emphasis on official records and verifiable sources, and the hierarchy of evidence that privileges written documents over oral transmission, tends to obscure. Historical truth is not simply what the archives contain. It is also what the archives were built to exclude. And the exclusions are not random. They follow the lines of power. The people whose experiences were most systematically excluded from the official record are precisely the people whose experiences the powerful most needed to be excluded, because including them would have required acknowledging things that the system of power was organized around not acknowledging. The archive is not neutral. It is a political document, and reading it critically means reading not just what it says, but what it refuses to say, and asking who benefits from that refusal, and following that question back through the institutional history of the archive itself, until you arrive at the human decisions made by specific people with specific interests that determined what would be preserved and what would be lost. The New Madrid seismic zone continues to be monitored by the United States Geological Survey
and by a network of university-based seismological research programs. The scientific consensus is that the zone remains capable of producing major earthquakes, that the geological conditions that generated the 1811 and 1812 sequence have not been fundamentally altered by those events, and that the recurrence interval for major seismic events in the zone, while uncertain, is measured in centuries rather than millennia. This means that the question of what another major New Madrid earthquake would do to the contemporary infrastructure of the Mississippi River Valley is not a hypothetical, but a planning concern, one that emergency management agencies and infrastructure engineers and public health officials think about with varying degrees of seriousness and varying degrees of public transparency. The physical vulnerability of the region is well understood by the people whose job it is to understand it. What is less well understood, or perhaps more precisely what is less often discussed in the planning documents and the risk assessments and the emergency response frameworks, is the social dimension of that vulnerability. The question of which communities in the contemporary New Madrid region are most exposed to the consequences of a major seismic event, and why, and what the history of land use and land ownership and institutional investment and disinvestment in that region over the past 2 centuries has to do with the answer. The communities along the Mississippi River Valley in Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky that are most physically exposed to the effects of a major New Madrid earthquake are, in significant measure, the same communities that have been most systematically excluded from the institutional and economic resources that would make them more resilient. This is not a coincidence. It is the product of 2 centuries of decisions about where to invest and where not to invest, about which communities deserve infrastructure and which ones can manage without it, about whose safety is a planning priority and whose safety is an afterthought. Those decisions were not made randomly. They were made in a context shaped by the history we have been tracing in this account. The history of who was allowed to own land in the New Madrid region and who was not, of whose losses were recorded and whose were not, of whose presence in the landscape was acknowledged by the official record and whose was managed into invisibility. The earthquake of 1811 did not create that history, but it illuminated it, briefly and cataclysmically, in the way that major disruptions sometimes illuminate the fault lines that run beneath the ordinary surface of social life. And then the water came back, and the surface closed over, and the official record resumed its work of describing a world in which certain things had not happened, and certain people had not existed, and the ground beneath the settlement of Little Prairie was simply ground, innocent of everything that had been placed in it, and everything that the earth, in its one extraordinary moment of geological candor, had briefly tried to give back. There is a place in southeastern Missouri where the land drops suddenly, a subtle but unmistakable depression in the topography that locals have called, for as long as anyone can trace the naming, the Hollow. The name is unremarkable. The region is full of such informal topographical designations, names given by people living close to the land to features that matter to navigation and agriculture and daily life, but that do not rise to the level of official cartographic significance. The Hollow is not on any map. It does not appear in any land survey. It is simply a place that people who know the region know about, a place that sits in the local geography with the quiet persistence of things that have been there long enough to be taken for granted. Dorothy Ellenson Price visited the Hollow in 1981, directed there by Mr. C in one of their later interviews. He had described it to her with the careful specificity of someone transmitting a location that had been transmitted to him, a set of landmarks and directions that constituted a kind of map held in memory rather than on paper. She found it without difficulty. She described it in her notebook as a low area of perhaps 2 acres, heavily overgrown, with soil that felt different underfoot than the surrounding ground, softer, and with a quality she described as unsettled, as though the ground had been disturbed at some point and had not fully recovered its composition. She noted that the vegetation in the hollow was different from the surrounding area in ways that she, not being a botanist, could not precisely characterize, but that struck her as significant, denser and darker, and with a quality of growth that suggested to her a different relationship between the soil and what was in it. She did not dig. She understood that she was not equipped to do what digging in that place would require, and she understood also that doing it wrong would be worse than not doing it at all, would disturb something that deserved to be disturbed only with the full care and expertise and moral seriousness that the situation demanded. She took photographs. She wrote her description. She recorded the location as precisely as she could in terms of landmarks and distances from identifiable reference points. And she wrote at the bottom of the notebook page that describes her visit, a single sentence that she apparently added sometime after the visit itself, because the ink is different and the handwriting slightly more deliberate, as though she had thought carefully about what she wanted to say, and then said it with intention. The sentence reads as follows: "Someone should come here who knows how to listen to the ground."
Someone should come here who knows how to listen to the ground. Dorothy Ellenson Price died in the year 2000. Her photographs of the hollow, if they survive, are somewhere in the community archive that holds her collection, uncatalogued in the portions of the collection that the archive's minimal resources have not yet processed. The hollow itself, if it still exists in the form she described, is somewhere in the landscape of southeastern Missouri, unmarked and unnamed on any official document, held in the memory of the communities whose oral tradition has maintained a knowledge of it across generations, in the same way that it maintained the knowledge of everything else this account has described. Waiting. Patient in the way that the earth is patient, holding what it was given, and available, still, to anyone who comes with the right questions and the willingness to hear whatever the ground, in its slow and nonverbal and utterly indifferent way, might be prepared to say.
We began this journey with the earth moving. We began with a sound that no vocabulary had prepared anyone to hear, with the ground opening beneath a frontier settlement in the early hours of a December morning, and swallowing everything that the people who lived there had built and buried and tried to keep hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. We began with geology, but we have arrived, as all honest engagements with history eventually arrive, at something that geology alone cannot explain or contain. We have arrived at the human story underneath the geological one, at the people whose names the official record did not preserve, and whose experiences the documentary tradition was specifically constructed to exclude, and at the extraordinary, quiet, generation-spanning act of resistance through which the communities most affected by what happened at Little Prairie refused to allow the truth of it to be entirely lost. That refusal is the most important thing in this account, more important than the earthquakes themselves, more important than the geological mechanisms that produced them, more important than the fraud and the violence and the institutional erasure that the earthquakes briefly illuminated and then the river covered again. The refusal to forget is the most important thing, because it is what makes this moment possible. It is what makes it possible for us to be here, together, in whatever darkness or light surrounds you right now, wherever you are watching from, whatever hour it is where you are, engaging with a truth that was supposed to have been permanently and successfully buried. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 are remembered in the standard historical account as a geological event of extraordinary magnitude and relatively limited human consequence. The standard account notes the low population density of the affected region and draws from that the conclusion that the human cost, while real, was not catastrophic in the way that a comparable event in a densely populated area would be. This conclusion is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. It measures human cost only in the terms that the official record provides, only in the counts and the tallies and the documented losses of the people whose losses were documented. It does not measure what it cannot see, which is the full human reality of a place where a significant portion of the population was legally classified as property, where their deaths were recorded as inventory discrepancies or not recorded at all, where the violence that preceded the geological violence of the earthquakes left no official trace, because the systems that create official traces were operated by the people most invested in ensuring that no trace was left. The true human cost of the New Madrid earthquakes cannot be calculated. This is not a failure of historical method. It is a fact about the nature of the event and the nature of the record that surrounds it. We do not know how many people died at Little Prairie. We do not know how many of the people who died there had been placed in the ground before the earthquake moved it. We do not know the names of the people whose remains the liquefaction briefly surfaced and the river then covered. We do not know what Sarah said to the territorial court in 1814 that was deemed not material to the proceeding and accordingly not entered into the record. We do not know with certainty Harlan Joss was, or what became of him, or what he knew about the ground beneath the settlement he inhabited. We do not know what M. Beaumont meant when she wrote, "He put us there," in the margin of a legal document that the official system had already decided not to hear.
We do not know these things because the systems that might have recorded them were operated by people who had decisive reasons for ensuring they were not recorded, and because the people who did know them had no access to those systems and were forced instead to maintain their knowledge through the slower and more vulnerable, but ultimately more durable mechanism of direct human transmission across generations. What we do know is this: people lived at Little Prairie. They lived there in relationships of extreme inequality, under conditions of violence and coercion that the legal and social systems of their time normalized and protected. Some of them died there in ways that were not natural and were not recorded. The earth held what they left behind. When the earth moved, briefly and incompletely and without any moral intention whatsoever, it surfaced some of what it had been holding. The river covered it again. The official record looked away. And the communities with the most direct connection to what happened, the communities whose memory of it is the only surviving testimony to its full dimensions, carried that memory forward across 2 centuries, without institutional support, without official acknowledgement, without any mechanism for inserting what they knew into the record that the powerful maintained about that place and that time. Dorothy Ellison Price knew that someone should come to the hollow who knows how to listen to the ground. She wrote that sentence in 1981 and died in 2000, and the someone she was calling for has not yet come, or has not yet come with the full complement of resources and expertise and institutional backing that the work would require. But the call is still open. The ground is still there. The community archive that holds her tapes and notebooks still exists, still operates with minimal resources, still waits for the attention that what it contains deserves. The oral traditions that preserved this knowledge across generations are still alive in the communities of the New Madrid region, carried by people who know that what they carry matters, even when the world around them has organized itself to suggest otherwise. This is what the earth of the New Madrid region holds, not just the geological record of tectonic stress and seismic release, not just the archaeological residue of frontier settlement and its material culture, but the human record of what was done in that place and to those people and through those systems, the record that the documentary tradition was built to exclude and that the oral tradition was built to preserve, the record that the earthquake of 1811 briefly and catastrophically offered to the surface, and that the river and the official apparatus of territorial administration quickly and deliberately covered again. It is still there, underneath the changed landscape, underneath the 2 centuries of subsequent history, underneath the surface of a region that has moved on in the way that regions move on, building new lives and new structures over the foundations of old ones, without always examining too carefully what those foundations are made of, or what they were built upon, or what they were built to conceal. The earth is patient. It holds what it is given. It does not forget, because forgetting requires intention and the earth has no intentions. It simply holds. And somewhere beneath the soil of southeastern Missouri, in a low place that does not appear on any map, in a depression in the landscape that locals have called the Hollow for as long as anyone can trace the naming, the ground holds what was placed in it before December 16, 1811, and what the earthquake surfaced and the river covered, and what no official document has ever acknowledged, and no institutional process has ever investigated, and no marked grave has ever commemorated. It holds the people whose names were not recorded as names. It holds the evidence of what was done and by whom and in what system of power, and with what degree of institutional protection. It holds all of it, in the patient, indifferent, completely reliable way that the earth holds everything it is given. Someone should come who knows how to listen. And when they do, when the right questions are finally asked of the right ground by the right people with the right tools, and the moral seriousness that the situation demands, what the earth says back will not be a surprise to the communities that have been saying it for 200 years. It will simply be, finally, a version of the truth that the official record cannot look away from. A version that has a paper trail. A version that can be footnoted and cited, and entered into the documentary tradition that has, for 2 centuries, maintained its silence about what happened at Little Prairie, with the same deliberateness and the same consequences as every other silence this account has described. Until then, the ground holds, the memory holds, and this story, the story that was never supposed to survive, is here. You have heard it. You are now among the people who carry it. And that, in the tradition of the communities whose courage made this account possible, is how the truth moves forward. Not through institutions, not through official records, but through people. Through the simple, radical, generation-spanning act of one person telling another what happened in the dark, and that person remembering, and passing it on. This has been Liturgy of Whispers. If this story moved something in you, if it opened a question you did not have before, or deepened one you were already carrying, leave it in the comments below. Tell me where you are. Tell me what hour it is. Tell me what you are thinking. Because this channel exists for exactly this. For the stories that the official record buried, and the human memory preserved. For the silences that have something to say if you know how to listen. Stay with us. The earth has more to tell.